Well, hi everybody. It's week 11, and this week we continued in our co-op class to look at the lives of the Pilgrims and what happened when they arrived in the New World, in North America, outside the zone, right? The red zone where they were supposed to go according to their original charter. So we started to look at what happened when they arrived. So our title for this week's lesson is How Did God Help the Pilgrims? That's the whole story. Is when they got here, how do we see God's providence, right? God's care and control over all his creation, always for our good. He's always working for our good and for his glory. Now, sometimes that means hard things are going to happen. And you guys, you certainly saw that. I know you've been studying and looking at the charts that showed how many people came and how many people actually lived through that first winter. And it's a sad thing and a hard thing to understand that even in all of that, God was working, that he was holding them in his hands, and that even all of this was his providence. We're certainly going to see some moments as we have all through their story where we went, wow, that's amazing. How could that happen? Was that luck? Was that coincidence? No, it never is, you all. It's always God's providence. Not one single molecule escapes the control of God. And of course, all along, we've been looking at how God is working in the hearts of our pilgrims, making them more and more like Jesus. So they're followers of Christ. They have Jesus living in their hearts. But God allows circumstances. He allows things into our lives, sometimes hard things, to shape us, our character, into the character of Jesus. And that is when our light shines before others, so that they may see our good works and give glory to our Father in heaven. Of course, that's the verse we've been working on. Here, let me get tiny there and go to that verse. And we can say it together. Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Not give glory to you, but notice that something's different about you. And of course, you've testified that that thing that's different is that you love Jesus. And so God gets the glory in those good works that you do. Well, that's exactly what we see in the lives of our pilgrims. So let's get started. We'll think about some of the reading that you did last week and how we reviewed it together in our co-op class. Just a quick reminder again that providence is God's care and control over all his creation. God's care and control over all his creation. So we started in our class by looking back at this map. And I actually gave you a copy of this map to have for your notebook. So I will trace it. And this week I do want you to color it for homework. Let me see if I have a color one. Yep, there. Yeah, like this is mine. And once you've finished coloring it, so you'll color all of the water a blue color and all of the land brown. And then it would be a good idea to go ahead and use your crayons or a pencil or something to put a little symbol at some of these little stops that we're going to talk about. But this is what we talked about in class. So the first thing we talked about was in God's providence. Let me go back one. We see God's providence and his care for his people in that he was moving them to exactly where he wanted them to be. You guys remember they were supposed to go south, way down here, closer to Jamestown. Not too close, right? Not too close. But the winds kept blowing them to the north. And finally, their captain, Christopher Jones, said, we have to come into this safe area inside this little hooky piece of land that's shaped like a hook. And we talked about it. Here's its name, Cape Cod, so that they come inside this harbor, inside Cape Cod. And this dot marks the first landing, the first spot that they came ashore. And this is where the men hunted a little bit. I was going to read to you just a little bit. When they describe coming ashore, it says Miles Standish, William Bradford, John Alden, and several of the others climbed down the rope ladder into their boat and rowed away. Now, several of the others, do you think that those were the women or the girls, boys, men? all men and maybe some older boys. Guys, that's who's going to go when it's dangerous and we need to go and explore this territory. That's who we send, right? They carried their guns and their axes, and they had an empty keg which they hoped to fill with fresh water. That which they had brought from England, the water was almost gone, and all were thirsty for a drink of cold, fresh water. Can you imagine what water must taste like after it's been sitting in a ship, in a barrel, for more than 2 months? Not very good anymore. In fact, probably getting less and less safe to drink that water. So they come ashore, and Captain Standish, who's their military man, says, look, I think 2 or 3 men had better stay near the boat while the others go into the forest. We would be in a sad plight if the Indians were to steal our boat while we're all gone. So John Alden and William Bradford stayed near the boat. Floating on the shallow water or flying through the air were hundreds of wild fowl. Y'all remember that word? Fowl? Fowl, fowl, and it means birds. The Pilgrims hadn't tasted fresh meat since they left England. What a treat some of these wild birds would be. The 2 men that were back at the boat, they knelt behind their boat and kept very still. After a while, the birds came near. Bang, bang, flashed the guns, and bang, bang, rang the echo. Away flew the birds, but John Alden ran along the shore, waded into the water, and picked up the ducks they'd killed. We will have a supper fit for a king tonight, he said to himself as he carried the birds back to the boat. And just a comment I want to make to you is that the Pilgrims, when they first came, they wrote about how plentiful the wildlife were for hunting. In fact, they said when the birds would fly across the sky, guys, it's hard for us to imagine today. There were so many, thousands and thousands of them, that when they would rise up out of the woods and fly across the sky, they would black out the sun. It would actually get dark for a few minutes until all the birds cleared away. Isn't that crazy to think about? So God had brought them to a place where there would be plenty of game to hunt, plenty of ducks and birds, and now eventually deer and other animals to hunt. Now that's still hard in the winter time, isn't it? In the wintertime, there's less game that's out for you to hunt. All right, so that's first landing, and we know that the very next day that the women did come ashore. Oh, here's our guys out hunting at first landing. And you know what? Now that I look at it, that picture is not very accurate, because who are all these? Who's that lady? And I'm not sure what this is showing, but it was only the men who went ashore. But the next day, the women do come ashore. They've determined that it's safe, and the women were going to do the washing. We haven't washed our clothes in 2 months. So they built fires underneath the great kettles to get that water nice and hot so that they could clean their clothing. So all of that happened at the first landing spot. But the men also climbed up in the trees. Do you remember that? And they looked far as they could look, and they saw that they were on this very narrow little piece of land, that there was water on this side and water here. They thought, gosh, this could be an island. It's too narrow. This is not going to be the best spot for us to settle, so we should keep looking. But remember, guys, it's already November 11th of 1620, which, by the way, as of the date of our recording, so right now, we're right at that very same time, but 405 years ago. So 405 years ago, this week was the very week that your Pilgrims came ashore in Cape Cod and started to explore. Now, the second place where they come ashore, they gave the name Cornhill, and you'll remember why, right? So they found a Indian settlement there, and nobody was there. And they began to explore and look around, and they found buried corn, 10 bushels of corn. Now, some of you were very concerned because you asked, how could they steal corn? Did they steal it? That's the big question, right? Now, do you think our very honest Pilgrims, who had been so careful to keep their word in Holland and had worked so diligently, do you think that now their internal character would just change and they would become thieves? Of course not. So they from the very beginning said, we will pay this back, but we need this corn. We found it. They believed God had provided it for them at just the right moment when they were running out of all food. And so they felt that they should take that corn, but they knew in their hearts they would pay it back. And some of you asked, well, how did they pay it back? So they paid it back in trade goods and later in corn that they themselves raised. So they replaced everything that they had taken and more. So you don't have to be concerned about the character of our pilgrims there. But Corn Hill was where God provided for them miraculously supplies that they needed. But still there, they looked around and thought, this isn't the best place for us to be. It doesn't have the fresh running water that we need. We also need a high place, like a big hill, because we need that for security. We need to be kind of up high where we can see around us in case any enemies are approaching. They decided Corn Hill was not the best place for them to settle. Now on my map, and you can kind of barely see it, but I took my crayons and I just did a little corn hill right here. I just put some little kernels of corn in a little pile to help me remember what happened at Corn Hill. Then they continued to journey to which direction, you guys? Here's your compass over here that tells you your directions. So if they're coming this way, which direction? South. They continued to come to the south, and this is where they landed and had what they called their first encounter. And that's because this is the first time that the Indians actually interacted with them. They had seen them in the distance before, but this is the first time that they actually have they meet up with one another. But the meeting wasn't a real friendly meeting, was it? So you'll remember that they were attacked. And I'm going to read to you a little bit of that. So by the time they come ashore here at the first encounter spot, guys, it's December. So it was November 11th. See, we see the date up here. November 11th was first landing, and now they've taken their time, several weeks, and it's now early December by the time of first encounter. Once again, it's the men who disembark or come off of the boat under the leadership of Captain Miles Standish. We know that their future governor, John Carver, William Bradford, John Alden, many of the other men, that they all came ashore to explore and see if this might be a good place. We know that they explored for a full day, and then they spent the night and were going to prepare to continue exploring the next day. They heard a loud, kind of frightening cry during the night. Do you remember that? Woke everybody up, and everybody was kind of on edge. But nothing happened during the night. But while they were sitting about the fire eating their breakfast, they heard a frightful sound nearby. "Watch, watch, ha ha, watch!" came the cry. The Pilgrims sprang to the boat for their guns. They fired several shots into the forest, thinking to frighten the Indians, but on they came. Nearer and nearer sounded the cry. "Watch, watch, ha ha!" I don't know how it actually sounded. About like that. Scarier than that, I'm sure. In the faint morning light, the Pilgrims saw the forms of many Indians slipping from tree to tree. Then whiz, whir, whir, sounded the arrows as they flew thick and fast. 2 of them stuck in John Howland's coat, and one struck Captain Standish above the heart, but he had his armor on, and the arrow did no harm. The Pilgrims quickly sprang away from the light of the fire. They tried to protect themselves in the dark shadows of the forest. Whiz! The arrows were flying from every direction, but not an Indian was to be seen. They, too, were well hidden behind trees and bushes. The Pilgrims kept very still. Then the Indians grew bolder. They crept silently toward the camp, their dark forms looking like dim shadows in the forest. This was just what the Pilgrims were waiting for. Bang! Boom! Roared their muskets. One of the bullets struck the Indian chief in the arm. He couldn't draw his bow again. With an angry yell, the warriors fled into the forest. The Pilgrims followed them a short distance, shouting and firing their muskets. When they returned to the camp, they picked up many arrows. Some were pointed with a sharp bit of deer horn, and some with eagle's claws. These arrows the Pilgrims sent to England when the Mayflower returned. Guys, they sent those back as illustrations of what they were facing here in the New World. They wanted people back at home to see these artifacts from a culture, from a people that they had couldn't even imagine, right? And so those arrowheads and arrows, they wound up in museums in England. And we do still have some of those samples, some of those original weapons that are on display today. So this represents that first encounter and what they might have seen, a Wampanoag warrior fighting against them. This is what the bows that they carried would have looked like, very tall bows. And then here's the arrows. But here's one that's in a museum that you can see today. It's laying on some deer skin, but you can see that carved horn that they used for an arrowhead, sometimes carved stone, sometimes with eagle's claw, right? As we talked about in the book. But something important to notice is, why were the Pilgrims able to turn them around and send them running? Because we had a different kind of weapon, a weapon that they did not have. So we have matchlock guns, or we have muskets that can be fired. They fire bullets. The bullets fly faster. They're more powerful. So we have a weapon that's superior. It's a better, more deadly weapon than what the Indians have. So I have posted a video so that you can see how the type of gun that they used and how it was fired and even how it was cleaned. And I've posted that to this week's website so that you can watch that video and learn a little bit about the types of guns that John Alden and William Bradford and Miles Standish would have carried and would have fired that day at first encounter. Now, once again, they'll decide that this is clearly not a good place for us to bring the women and children ashore and try to build our settlement. So they kept exploring. And by this time, you guys, it was so cold. They talked about when they would get in their boat that immediately the sea spray would kind of spray up all over them and they would be covered in like a coat of ice. It would immediately freeze on their beards and all over their clothes, and they would have like a crunchy coat of ice all over them. How difficult that must have been to keep going when probably all you wanted to do was hunker down and stay warm. But these were tough, intrepid men who continued to look for just the place. So at first encounter, I know my drawings aren't fabulous, but I just drew a little arrow so I could remember that that was where the Indians shot arrows at our exploring pilgrims. And then we can see on the map how they continued to press on, and they'll cover about 100 miles exploring from the time of first landing until they found just the spot, just the perfect spot. And y'all, I have to believe that God just encouraged their hearts, that I know that they were praying all along the way, asking God, where should we go? Lead us to just the place. We'll follow you wherever you lead. And God brought them, guys, to the absolute perfect place right here. And they called it Plymouth, and it had a protected harbor. Can you see that here on this map, how you come in? And so you're behind this little spit of land, and that protects you even more from the winds that are blowing out there in the ocean. So it was more protected, and the water was more peaceful. The water was more shallow. They could still bring their ship in, but it wasn't deep, deep water. And they were able to easily get to shore. When they got to shore, what they found that was most impressive were two things. First of all, well, I should say three things, but two things they were looking for was that high ground. So they saw this big hill, and they thought, this is perfect. We can build a fort at the top and fence this all around, and we'll be able to protect ourselves. So we'll have high ground where we can keep an eye on everything around us. So they liked that big hill, but fresh water. They found this beautiful brook. Right by that hill was this lovely brook or stream of water that flowed out, and it was fresh, spring-fed water, which is exactly what any human needs to survive. But they had a source of fresh water that was right by that hill. So they called it Town Brook, and this is where they decided to settle. So I drew a little house right there to show like this was the first place they started to build. Remember, they started to build that common house right there, and they called the town Plymouth, but you guys, it had another name before that. And they don't know the name yet. They're going to find out pretty quickly. Just a few months later, they'll find out the name, that it used to be called Patuxet. They did know somebody else had lived there, right? Because they found this abandoned site where everything was cleared away, and it appeared that people had been living there. But you and I know that what had happened is about 6 years before, a disease had swept through, and all the people, the Patuxet people, had died. So now no one lived there. So it was perfectly cleared little home site. for them to build. Everything had kind of been swept away. There weren't any existing Indian homes there anymore. Everything had gone away, but it was all clear and nobody wanted to come even close to this. The Indians didn't want this land because they thought that, since something terrible had happened there, they were afraid to build their homes there. They thought they would die too if they built their homes on that land. So nobody wanted it. It's the perfect, perfect place where God was leading our little pilgrim band. This is a picture of what Town Brook was like. And then, of course, we know that it's the middle of winter. It's freezing cold, very difficult conditions, and all those same men and boys would get off the ship every day and come ashore and start to build the common house. The common house was the one closest to the bay. So we're looking down the hill, and this is the only snowy picture I could find to kind of give you an image. But it would have been the first one way down the hill that they built was the common house. And they built it first. It was big. They knew later they could use it for church services until they built their church. They could use it for meetings, and they could use it for a hospital. They just needed a big place where they could get all of the sick people off of the ship and onto dry land, into a house with a warm fireplace, and try to help people survive and get better. So the common house was built. This is what the houses looked like by the spring. And here you can see this is Plymouth Harbor and the types of houses that they were building. They built them out of wood, which again, they had to go out there and chop down all those trees, do all that hard work in the middle of winter with frozen ground and difficult conditions, snowy, icy conditions. And then the roofs were made out of thatch. So you can see this thatch. I think I have a better picture. Hang on. There we go, thatch. And so we've stopped, and you guys did an exercise where you actually made some thatch. So we took some stalks, like reed stalks, just like they would find down at the waterfront. And so you harvest those and tie them in little bundles. And then those bundles are what they place on the roof very tightly together, bundle, 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 and multiple layers that overlap one another. And it forms a very tight seal that really doesn't leak very much. So thatch roof, just like they had back in England. That's what they built here. So we did our thatch exercise, and you guys did a great job. And of course, they continued to build homes here on this main little street that came up from the harbor, and they named their street Leyden Street. Isn't that fun? So you guys know, of course, they were thinking back to where they had just came from and the fond memories that they had of that place, a place that God had given them, a safe place where he had kept them for 12 years and where many of their friends and families still were. So Leyden Street is the main street coming up from the harbor through town. And by the time the spring came, 19 families were living here on Leyden Street. You all are studying some pilgrims, various people who came, and you're going to do a little presentation on your person. And so I wanted you to notice here on the map, where these people lived. So you have this map in your homework, and I want you to be sure to notice some of your people lost their families, so they went to live with somebody else. So you'll have to figure out who did they go to live with. And I want you on your map to color in the spot that shows where your pilgrim was living in the spring of 1621. This is what Leyden Street looks like today. And this house right here, these houses are old. In fact, many of them were built about the time of the American War for Independence, so about the time of George Washington, these houses. So they're old, but they're still 100 years younger than the Pilgrim houses. So these are not the Pilgrim houses. The Pilgrim houses over time were taken down and more substantial, beautiful homes were built there in Plymouth, but they're still very old. Right here, see this white house with the blue shutters? This was the very place that the common house was built. And if you walk along Leyden Street, you can see you're going up a hill, up a hill. And as you walk along Leyden Street today, if you read the little signs on each one of these houses, it tells you which pilgrims lived in that place, not in that same house, right? It's a new house, but who lived in each of those spots, which is pretty cool. So you can see where John Howland lived, where Dr. Fuller lived, where William Bradford lived, where William Brewster lived. So really cool to see that even today. Here's just one more view looking all the way. This goes this way. If you see my cursor goes down to the water. So this is looking up the hill, and then it continues to go up, up, up here. And it was way up at the top. That's where they finally built their church, which was also their fort. Isn't that interesting? There were cannons mounted on the top floor of the church to defend themselves. And this is Town Brook today. And of course, we saw thatching. Now, we talked about how many came, right? So you all know 102 passengers came on the Mayflower, and that one died. Dr. Fuller's servant, William Button, that he died on the way over. In fact, we read about that. I think we read about that already in your book, The Boy Who Fell Off the Mayflower. I'm going to read the rest of it to you today. Well, in a separate video, but you'll watch that this week as well and get the full story. But anyway, we lost one on the way over, but of course we had two babies born, right? Oceanus Hopkins and Peregrine White were both born. But you all have looked at these charts now, and you know that there was so much sickness and death during that winter of 1620 into 1621, so that by the spring of 1621, this was the situation, and only 51 of our pilgrims survived out of 102, so half exactly had died. There were only a couple families who survived in total, so almost everybody lost a family member. The Brewsters and the Hopkins, I believe, were the only two families, and Billingtons, I'm sorry. Brewster, Billington, Hopkins were the only families that remained intact, had all of their family members. Everybody else lost somebody. But in the spring, something amazing happened. In the spring, somebody showed up at the gate speaking English. And that man's name was Samoset. Now, Samoset spoke broken English, so not perfect English, but enough that he could say, "Welcome, Englishmen." And everyone was shocked because he was speaking their language. And he talked to them in sign language and showed them that he wanted to trade with them. Now, he had been sent by somebody who was much more important than he was, a chieftain named Massasoit. So Samoset was there on behalf, representing Massasoit, and he said he wanted to trade. Do y'all remember that he stayed in the town that night, that he stayed at the Hopkins house? Can you imagine? And that Mr. Hopkins stayed up all night, a little worried about who this guy was and what he was up to, and were his friends waiting outside to try to attack them? They just didn't know yet. So Samoset stayed the night, and then he came back with his friends and later came with Massasoit. But one of the main reasons they were coming is they wanted to trade. And so they would bring animal skins. They call them pelts, P-E-L-T-S. P-E-L-T-S, pelts. So that's what you see in the hands of this pilgrim, is a pelt, an animal skin that they could use for various things. They could make clothing and hats and all kinds of things. So they would send those things back to England, and they would trade copper pots and beads and tools, things that the Indians did not have. They would trade with them. So this is just a scene kind of showing you how they would meet in the common house to trade. But one of the most important things, and an incredible providence of God, was that Massasoit came to Plymouth and brought with him both Samoset and another Indian brave who had previously lived right there. Do you guys remember a young man named Squanto, right? Squanto came with him, and Squanto spoke perfect English. So Squanto could interpret. We did this sign for interpret. So he could tell Massasoit what John Carver and William Brewster were saying. He could explain it to him in his own Indian language. And then he could take whatever Massasoit was saying. The Pilgrims were very confused. They don't know. but he could tell them, well, this is what he said. So you guys, they were able to write out what's called a peace treaty. Say, we want peace between us. The Pilgrims wanted to have peace with their neighbors. That was one of the things they said. In fact, what did they want more than that? More than peace with their neighbors, they wanted their neighbors to know about Jesus. So it was very important to them that they live peacefully, that they would act like they were brothers. So they wrote out an agreement and said exactly that we're going to treat you just like we would treat Englishmen. We'll live according to the law, just, you'll be treated the same way that our people are treated. And if any one of our people does something bad to an Indian, they'll be punished just as if they had done it to an Englishman. So we're not going to let them get away with anything. And y'all, that happened. That actually happened. And when the Indians saw that we were true to our word and that we punished our own people if they did something terrible to an Indian, it won their trust. Do you think that was letting our light shine before others so that they may see our good works and give glory to our Father in heaven? Absolutely. So the way they lived their lives in front of the Indians that lived all around them was so important. But this peace treaty was signed. And at the end of the peace treaty, the way that they made it official, we're used to signing our names, but Massasoit doesn't write. So they don't have a written language. They don't read. So they don't write their letters. They just speak their language. So he'd never written his name. So how could he sign this peace treaty? Remember, he just made a cross mark on the paper. But the way they made a peace treaty official was they would smoke a pipe together. So everybody that was agreeing to it had to smoke the pipe. So that's what you see in this picture. And they called it a peace pipe. So you see Governor Carver smoking the peace pipe with Massasoit in this picture. But of course, we know that, again, that was an incredible providence of God. But Squanto becomes just an incredible, amazing picture of God's care for his people at a time when, y'all, this is after they've lost half of their number. This is when they have very sad hearts, and they must be wondering in their hearts, just what is God doing? They're continuing to praise him and to trust him, even in this very hard time. In fact, they were given an opportunity, right? Their captain said, you guys should come back to England. It's too hard. It's too much. How many went back to England? None. Nobody gave up. They all continued to trust God. And God brings them this incredible gift, a young man named Squanto. Now, to read more about Squanto's story and how he came to be here at this time, which is just a miracle, you have this book at your house. So it is called Squanto and the Miracle of Thanksgiving. So if you haven't read it recently, you should pause me right now and let your mom or dad read you this story and then come back to me to talk more about Squanto. But Squanto was a special gift from God to the Pilgrims. And of course, you've read the story. This was his hometown. But guys, he had only gotten back here just a few months ago. So the fact that a ship was able to bring him back at just this time, and that he was actually captured by Massasoit, so he was living with the Wampanoags and living with Massasoit, and he really was kind of a prisoner at this moment, and that Massasoit would send him to this place. All of that. Boy, were they lucky or what? No luck, no coincidence, all God's providence. He was putting together this amazing timing, this amazing perfect placement to bless the Pilgrims and to bless Squanto. So providence, again, is God's care and control over all his creation. And here we see it. Squanto had only been back in North America a few months before the English arrived, and they settled in Patuxet, the exact spot where his people had lived before. So how did Squanto help them? Well, the first thing we already heard about was that he came with Massasoit, and he was the translator. So he helped to translate so they could understand one another, so that they could laugh at the things that one another said that were funny. Otherwise, no one would know when somebody was telling a joke or not, right? So when we see this scene of them getting along together, the only reason that they can do that is because they have somebody who can translate the words. So Squanto made peace possible between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, but Squanto also just made relationship possible. So he was a translator, right? He was also a guide. So I'll do this for guide, right? He showed them the lay of the land, or you could do this if you want. Okay, they didn't have binoculars, so he showed them. He showed them where not to go. He showed them the great places to hunt. But just as importantly, don't hunt over there because there are some enemies that might attack you in this area. So only hunt here. This is the best spot. So he was a great guide for them. So he was a translator and he was a guide for them. He was also a teacher, though. He taught them how to fish in Town Brook. So we said fishing was like this, right? Do you see that fish trap? So you pick up the fish trap basket. That's how you caught fish. So he taught them how to build the fish trap basket because that's how you could catch fish in the brook. Every year, you guys, this was, again, so unusual, but so perfect. Every year, there are fish called alewife, and they travel upstream. So the brook is going this way, and the fish come upstream in the fall. And you can catch, thousands of fish swim upstream to lay eggs, kind of like salmon do. And they swim up to get into ponds and then come back down. Well, when they're doing that, they're very easy to catch. You can catch them with a basket. And Squanto knew that. Why did he know it? Because this is where he used to live. So he showed them how to make those fish trap baskets, and they would catch the fish. So he was their interpreter, right? He was their guide. He taught them how to fish, but he also taught them how to plant corn. So he taught them how to farm. So we can show planting. And corn seeds, certainly, but also wheat and just about anything else that they needed to grow. New England, Cape Cod, has very sandy, rocky soil. So you need fertilizer. They were frustrated because the Englishmen were frustrated because their seeds were not growing well. Well, it wasn't warm, moist soil like they were used to. And again, Squanto knew that in order to grow food there, you had to add extra fertilizer. And the fertilizer they used were fish. So all those fish that they caught out of the brook, some of them they would eat, but most of them were kept to use as fertilizer. And then we did a little fun activity. Do you remember? Well, first we went outside and we actually planted our corn seeds. Go. We'll get big for a second. We took our corn seed and we actually put it in the dirt, and you guys got to pick up an actual fish, even though my fish fell apart a little bit, but we took an actual fish and stuck it down in the dirt. So everybody planted some corn with some fish fertilizer for real. But then, after washing our hands, we came inside and did something that was a little tastier. We did the fake version, right? So we took some chocolate pudding for our dirt and covered in crushed Oreos. And then we stuck some Swedish fish down in there with our candy corn seed. So we planted our seed and fertilized it with Swedish fish and then enjoyed our snack, right? Then we had some other activities just to remember the importance of corn and grain to the Pilgrims and how Squanto was a great teacher for them. So we went outside and we did a corn relay. Do y'all remember? Here, I'll make this big. So you guys harvested the corn and put it into the containers and had a race to see who could harvest the corn the fastest. When we were finished with that, we made our corn dance. We did a little experiment, and all the instructions are on the class website, but we just for fun, the Pilgrims would not have done that, but just for fun, we made our corn dance in its container. Then we went inside and we actually ground some of that corn. Now, the Indians and the Pilgrims, they would have ground their corn with a big stick or with stones, rubbing stones together, and they put that corn, guys, between it and crush it, crush it, crush it until it was a powder. But today we have appliances that will do that for us. So if you remember, I took you inside and we poured that corn into a grinder and we just whizzed it right up and turned it into powder. And that powder, you would call it cornmeal. And they could use that. So they didn't just have to eat like boiled corn or corn on the cob. They could make flour out of it and make cakes and cookies and whatever, all corn flour based. So that was, again, another important thing that they learned from Squanto that helped them survive and thrive there in Cape Cod. So you all, Squanto, who was their interpreter, who was their guide, who taught them to fish and how to farm. Squanto was a special instrument sent by God for their good beyond their expectation. That's what William Bradford wrote. Those were his very own words about Squanto. What does that mean? He was a special instrument. He wasn't like everybody else, was he? God had prepared him uniquely. He had individuality, didn't he? His experiences, all the things that he had gone through in his life. He was a lot like Joseph, wasn't he? Sold into slavery, held in a different place, a place he didn't want to be, kept away from his family, but then used by God to save many people, to keep many people from starving. That's what Joseph did in Egypt, and that's what Squanto did for the Pilgrims. So hard things happened in Squanto's life as well, but in the end, all for the glory of God, and for the good of the Pilgrims, and for the good of Squanto. Y'all, part of the story that most people don't talk about is that Squanto doesn't live very much longer. He was still a pretty young man, but something happened to him and he got very sick the very next year. After the first Thanksgiving, he got sick the next year and he died. But William Bradford wrote about him. He said when Squanto became sick and near death, he asked the governor to pray for him that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. So while I don't know and you don't know exactly what happened in the heart of Squanto, we know that he wanted the governor to pray for him to go to heaven and be with the Englishman's God. Now, you guys, nobody asks you for that unless they have fallen in love with your God, right? So they don't ask you for that if they hate your God or they think that you're a terrible person. So again, Matthew 5:16, do you think that the Pilgrims had let their light shine before Squanto so that he could see their good works and give glory to their Father in heaven? Yes. And it was such an important part of him wanting to go to be in heaven with their same God. He wanted what they had. You guys, that's our job, is to make people want what we have been given so freely, the grace of God. So, reminding us, though, of where we were at the time of the first Thanksgiving in 1621 in the fall, when the harvest had come in. And actually, let's pause for a second before we look at this picture. I'll make myself big and block it out a little bit. They had had a good harvest. Again, thanks largely to Squanto and what he had taught them. But what were some of the foods that they had harvested? Well, it talks about it in your book. So I'm going to read to you just a little bit of this. We know that there were sweet wild strawberries on the sunny hills, and groups of boys and girls filled their baskets with wild raspberries and juicy blackberries from the bushes. Sugar was too scarce to be used for jellies and preserves, although later it would be, but trays of those wild fruits were placed in the sun to dry to use in the winter. So did they have berries to use in pies? And yes, they did. So they couldn't make jellies, but they could save them all up and use them with honey and with maple syrup to make sweet treats in the fall. Your book also says the fresh green of the wheat fields began to turn a golden brown. The harvest was ripening. Before long, the air rang with the steady beat of the flail as the Pilgrims were threshing their first crop of golden grain. So they harvested wheat and corn. It also says every day Squanto went with a merry group of boys to gather up chestnuts and hickory nuts and beech nuts and walnuts. So they had nuts from the trees that they could crack open. Later, there's a little bit of a story, I think, about Love Brewster and Francis Billington cracking nuts and picking out the plump kernels for the cakes that Priscilla was making. So they were going to take those nuts and crush them up and use them in some of their recipes. So, okay, that's interesting. That means we know that was one other dish that they had at the Thanksgiving meal. Do y'all remember some of the other things that they might have eaten? We know that they planted, let's see, the hillside was green with growing corn and wheat and vegetables. So we would have had vegetables like squash. I don't know. I can't think of, I know squash and pumpkins and things like that. Certainly they would have had at their Thanksgiving feast. They had meat, didn't they? And they had fish and they had shellfish. We know they had clams, turkey, deer, rabbit, things that they could hunt in the woods. So all of that. But we know that the Indians, they were invited and lots of them came. 90 of them came, all men. No women came, so 90 of the Wampanoag Braves came to this Thanksgiving feast. And we know that they brought venison or deer with them. We know that there were turkeys that were shot, so that they were serving turkey. Now, my question is, okay, so all this food, you guys can probably think of some other things too that you read about in the book. But number one, why were we having this party? Well, it tells us here. And William Bradford told us in his writings. But here's what it said in your book. Governor Bradford said, "Friends, God has blessed our summer's work and has sent us a bountiful harvest. He brought us safe to this new home and protected us through the terrible winter. It is fit that we have a time for giving thanks to God for his mercies to us. What say you? Shall we not have a week of feasting and Thanksgiving?" A whole week. You guys, we just have one day. They celebrated for a week with food and with games and festivities and singing and dancing. What a wonderful time that must have been in Plymouth. But all of it focused on thanking God for what he had done. Now I do want you to see this picture before we wrap up here. Because if you had 90 Indians who came and you had 51 Pilgrims who had survived, that's 141 people who are all eating and celebrating. Who is doing all the cooking? Well, we know that only 4 adult women, 4 of the mothers, survived that winter. So I want you to see the 4 ladies. It would have been Mrs. Billington, Mrs. Brewster, Mrs. White, and Mrs. Hopkins. They were the only 4 adult women who survived. Now, there were some older teenage girls, and I'm sure, of course, they would help. In fact, in your book, it talks a lot about the best cook of them all was 19-year-old Priscilla Mullins. So here she is right here, Priscilla Mullins. And y'all, there were 5 young women who were between, I think, 14 years old and 19. They were just teenagers. And so certainly they would have helped. But that's still a lot of work, isn't it? For all those people to be fed and entertained for 5 days. So of course we've read about and you can know for sure that the children were helping to do certain jobs in the kitchen. They were chopping nuts and preparing food and maybe grinding corn into meal and doing things to help all those ladies fix the food. Something else I thought would be interesting for you to see was this statue. This is a statue that's in Plymouth today, and it's called the Pilgrim Maiden statue because it reminds us there's a whole separate memorial for the women, the mothers who came and the mothers who gave up their lives so that their children would live. But the Pilgrim Maiden remembers those teenage girls who came, and when the older women were gone, had to step up into their place and do hard work at age 14, 15, and 19. And the Pilgrim Maiden, here she stands on this rock. Why do you think she's standing on a rock like that? Well, it's remembering the landing of the Pilgrims when they first arrived, that they stepped out onto Plymouth Rock. And tradition tells us that it was one of those young women who was the first one to step out onto Plymouth Rock, that it was young Mary Chilton who was the first one to touch her foot onto Plymouth Rock. But it also should remind us that these people came to be stepping stones, right? To lay down their lives so that other people could move the gospel forward. And if you look closely at our Pilgrim Maiden, this young lady, she's holding something in her hand. Can you see what that is? It's a book. What book do you think that is? It is, of course, a Bible. So she's strong in her faith and her trust in God, and she looks confidently forward, even through the snows and the difficulties of the winter that's all around her. And you guys, that's the story of our Pilgrim Maidens. And I know that my girls, two of my girls, have Pilgrim Maidens rather, that you're researching. So I thought you might like to even include this picture in your presentation, the Pilgrim Maiden statue. But this is what the inscription says on the statue in Plymouth. It says, "To those intrepid English women whose courage, fortitude, and devotion brought a new nation into being." This statue of the Pilgrim Maiden is dedicated. Now, I'm not going to teach you all those words right now, but if you are researching Mary Chilton or Elizabeth Tilley or Priscilla Mullins, you should probably look those words up, find out what intrepid means. What's fortitude? What's devotion? Guys, those are all character qualities that God developed in the hearts of those young girls so that they could bring America into being. So those would be good words to look up as you study your character this week. So you all, your homework this week is really just to get prepared for our co-op Thanksgiving feast. At their Thanksgiving feast, I want you to remember that they had just come through very hard times, and they had lost so many friends and family members, and their hearts must have still been very sore. And yet, in the midst of all this, they were able to say, "Praise be to the Lord." And that William Bradford was able to direct them to a time of thanksgiving. That was what they most needed, was to stop in the midst of any and every circumstance and give thanks to God. And so that's exactly what they did. So as we prepare our hearts for our Thanksgiving that we'll celebrate together, let's reflect on this verse, Psalm 107:1. "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." I'll see you on Thursday.